everybody.
Afternoon.
Hello.
Hi. That was a great lead-in for this session. It's my great pleasure to introduce our panelist, Lisa McNally. At the end there, she's head of Cleantech and Sustainability for Thoughtworks.
Hello. Happy to
Jared
be here.
Connors, my new friend, who's with Ascent, and you're global head of CSR. You're a subject matter expert, senior subject matter expert.
Well, we'll just call it ESG guy. How about that?
ESG, okay. And then Gary Leviton, who's with WeWork, and he's in charge of global procurement, sourcing, and supply chain.
No ESG in the title.
Okay, no LMNOP. Okay, no. We can joke about it, but we all know how very serious it is. So, would you say a little bit, starting with Lisa, about your work and what you do and your company?
Sure. Can you all hear me? Is this too low? Okay.
Yes.
Hi there. Lisa McNally, head of Cleantech and Sustainability for Thoughtworks. How many of you all have heard of Thoughtworks? Awesome. Great. That's good. We are a global software consultancy. We offer digital transformation services to enterprise clients. We also work with nonprofits and the government sectors. And I have had the small honor to build out our Cleantech and Sustainability service line, especially now with all of this talk about ESG. There's opportunities to be working with our clients around sustainability, but in fact, I've been doing sustainability for 20 years, and Thoughtworks has been focused on sustainability and climate justice for just as long as well, in addition to being committed to open source work. So all of those components have kind of come together again, and I now have the opportunity to bring that lens to our clients using clean tech and technology, and happy to define that further, but I think this audience is aware of what clean tech is. And that is me up there. I realize that's short curly hair and I'm in my long straight hair phase, but I'm the same person.
And Jared, please.
Yeah. All right. I'm going to risk it and say, how many people have heard of Ascent here? More than 3, please. Okay. Got to beat you right there.
Really?
Beat you.
I think I saw 6 people for me.
Yeah. Okay. So, I counted 3. I was just counting light for me. But if you haven't heard of Ascent, come to our booth. We're out in the showroom floor. We're also the group that's auctioning off the Brooklyn Bridge. So leave your business card in there to win the Brooklyn Bridge. So my name is Jared Connors. I've been working on CSR, sustainability, ESG since way before it was popular. I started out in the electronics industry doing this from within, and now I work with Ascent, and I've been here for several years at Ascent, and our mission is to help companies engage the supply chain, whether it be from product compliance topics and regulations in the European Union to sustainability efforts within their supply chain. So now I don't just build this for one company, we build solutions for literally hundreds of companies around the globe. So
I guess I have to do the show of hands. WeWork TV show. Yeah.
All right, you win. All right.
So
Lisa, pay him.
I'm the guy from the company in the TV show who's the only one here not wearing a blazer, which fits in perfectly with the actual TV show and company. So I'm the global head of procurement and supply chain at WeWork. WeWork, for those of you who don't know what we are, we're a flex space office company. And basically we rent out entire buildings or floors, fill it with amenities, technology, furniture, and just create spaces that are ready for either enterprise clients like Google, Facebook, all the other fancy names, American Airlines, United, but also just for people who don't just want to work from home. They want a co-working facility where they can network with other people, have water cooler conversations, drink great coffee, etc. So because of that, and we have over 700 properties around the globe in every major city on the planet. So because of that, we actually have a pretty complex supply chain function, because these, although we're a space company, meaning the space is our product, the space comes fully equipped and supplied. And we have about 2 weeks from the end of construction until people need to be able to use the space to get it ready. So I manage that supply chain function direct from the manufacturer into each of these projects around the planet with 2 weeks to install. So I actually have a long history in ESG as well. I actually started on the oil industry side and came over also when it was not really the thing to do in the mid-2000s. So I've been mostly less about CSR, but mostly about ESG and clean energy and renewable energy for close to 20 years.
And I'm John Doyle. I worked in the pharmaceutical industry for many years, left Merck 20 years ago, where I was head of corporate communication, was the world's largest healthcare company at the time. And one of the environment ESG programs we worked on was a drug called Mectizan for a disease called onchocerciasis, which ravages the health and the eyesight of millions of people in sub-Saharan Africa. And I happened to be in the boardroom when Dr. Roy Vagelos, the CEO, then decided we would give it away to anybody who needed it. And Merck is still donating Mectizan to anybody in the world, tens of millions of people. In fact, one of my former students, Carol Richardson, is here, I think, and she could give you an update. But I think it's been the most dynamic, socially responsible initiative. It's prevented blindness or cured it in tens of millions of people, and Merck decided to give it away every year. And the person who won the Nobel Prize in Medicine for 2018, I think, 15 years after the donation, was still involved. So, and then I worked in reputation management, which is the umbrella. It's not communications, the umbrella for heightening the good things you do and preventing a crisis. So reputation crisis management is what happens when reputation management fails. I wrote the first book on that and taught the world's first graduate and undergraduate courses. Doesn't make me smart necessarily, but I've been around a long time.
We have flexible office space, though.
All it says is I have longevity. And when I try to retire, it doesn't work because I retire from here up. So it doesn't work for me. Let's start with a question we've discussed somewhat, and I think complements all the panel sessions, all the sessions we've been in today. And that is we'll start with Gary. What are the impacts of the various supply chain parts, the verticals, on carbon emissions?
So depending on your business, but for most businesses, the overall carbon impact of your supply chain typically is substantially greater than your scope 1 emissions. And we'll talk about the different scopes for anybody who wants a refresher. But really, I'll dive a little bit deeper. It really depends on what your corporate goals are. It depends how far downstream you want to go, what you're looking to actually impact. And the deeper that you go, the further downstream in your supply chain that you go, the more profound the impact, the more complex the calculations are. And right now, as a side, I, over the last year, have started gaining a little traction in just like really getting close to the source of a lot of the products that we get manufactured to us. And it just, because of the various supply chain issues, because of alternative methods that manufacturers are now trying to source either labor or goods or materials, it's just getting more difficult, the transparency, and I think actually increasing the overall impact of carbon footprint. So I think this is a really pivotal moment for us in the supply chain.
And Jared, that leads into, might sound like a basic question, but I think it's important for everybody as a foundation to understand what are scope 1, 2, and 3 emissions.
Yeah, it's a common question that actually gets asked, or I would say misunderstood, in the way that companies are trying to track things. And obviously there's a lot of organizations that are very focused on things that they feel they can control, their scope 1 and scope 2. And we're here to talk specifically about supply chain today and scope 3. And there's so much more parts of scope 3, but I like to think of it like this. Scope 1 is as your direct energy consumptions, things that you're purchasing and you can control. Scope 1.4, leased or owned vehicle fleet, right? To indirect emissions in Scope 2, your static municipal draw, as it's commonly said, a fancy way to say what my power bill tells me. And then Scope 3, we've heard from many speakers today already, covering everything from, Scope 3 emissions for employee travel, right? In 2 sessions this afternoon, in fact. But supply chain in general can be a variety of different things in the 15 different scopes of Scope 3, right? So it depends on what your focus is and where you're trying to find those opportunities. Is it in a recycle program? Is it like what we heard from Campbell's earlier today with adding drip systems to tomato plants to help reduce emissions, within their supply chain? Or is it all the way to my manufacturing that I'm doing in the APAC region to develop my products essentially?
Super. Does anybody want to elaborate on that? Because it's so important, for example, with the proposed SEC conveying a materiality restriction on emissions. That's mainly will be Scope 3, will it not? Well, and I know we're going to get to that.
Yeah, actually, if we heard the SEC chair's video this morning, I was really hoping that would be in person personally, and I was racing to it. I don't know how many of you guys were excited about that opportunity and thinking about HR Bill 1187, right? And what mandatory climate disclosures really mean for organizations. I get asked this question every day. I actually have a joke in my home office. I have 2 jars on my office, and one is about mandatory climate disclosures where I have to put $1 in it every time somebody asks me, a client or a prospect asks me about it. My other one is about Russian sanctions right now. So I have dollars in both those jars that is getting pretty big, and I call it my daughter's treat jar actually. But anyway, mandatory climate disclosures, and what we heard today was, the jury's still out a little bit, but unless you make a commitment to reduction of Scope 3, then you don't necessarily have to, you're not required to disclose. Now, the one thing that I would argue for a lot of manufacturers out there that, that are essentially designing everything in the Bay Area and Cupertino, California, right? And everything is being assembled and procured through the APAC region. Scope 3 is the only way that they're going to meet a reduction target. Right? So if you fall into that category as a company who makes this monitor right here, but you don't directly manufacture it, you're procuring those goods, you're designing that, then supply chain is going to be 99% of your reduction opportunities. And so if you're going to make a commitment to carbon neutral or reduction efforts in general, the only way you're going to achieve that is therefore within your supply chain. And then making a disclosure about it means that you're going to be reporting on it according to that materiality assessment. So I thought that was a very interesting way that he chose to word that today on that video. And I just got the impression that was just very carefully crafted in the way that he was wording that.
I mean, I'll be honest. What I'm a little nervous about is that there's still a lack of universally accepted methodology on how this is benchmarked, how this is measured, what's acceptable, how deep you have to go. And I mean, this is kind of what we run into to this day with Scope 1 and RE100 and things like that. And with the added complexity of a supply chain like you described, that can go on, I'm exaggerating, but infinitely. I think that I'm just worried about that barrier that different industries, different verticals are going to, they're going to report differently, they're going to translate whatever the SEC ruling finally comes out as differently, and I think they're going to have the bandwidth to do it. And this is just a really great opportunity to implement some kind of universal, single accepted standard.
Mm-hmm. Before we dive more deeply into that, which we must, Lisa McNally has spent her career studying at Berkeley sustainability way before most people knew how to spell it, and working in the field. So tell us a little bit about what Gary was talking about, the tools for measurement of emissions and the way to mitigate emissions. I know that's a big subject.
Yeah, it's really big. So let me first start with, there are many approaches, obviously, to mitigate emissions, and they all come with their set of complexities. So on one hand, of course, you have offsets. I would consider that an approach to mitigation, although it may not be a complicated technology. There are many companies, I think some of them sponsoring the event, who really use technology and satellite imagery and data to really get really precise with the data that would be used to measure those offsets. And on the other side, we have AI, which impacts the decision making to help customers look at ways to avoid it in the first place. The way that Thoughtworks approaches sustainability with our clients is to really focus on the side of avoiding it in the first place. And of course, that's very complex. And we do use AI and machine learning to help our customers do that. I would say that, although that might be a more complicated process, there's everything in between. So we have something right now that from a purely tactical standpoint, to help get at Scope 3 emissions, we are helping our clients use open software that we call the Cloud Carbon Footprint Tool. And something that gets back at this measurement idea is that it's open source. The methodology is obviously open and transparent, and the community can contribute to it. And it helps set that baseline for customers, but not only does it help set the baseline, it also helps them take actions to reduce the emissions. And this is looking at the emissions across all public cloud providers. And so this gets at transparency with measurement, accuracy, real-time data. I don't know if anything is real time unless you really are using satellites and having technology that's monitoring the carbon as it's emitted. But in the meantime, I think to set the baseline, we really just need to know, as people have said all day today, you have to start somewhere. But with cloud computing, there's so much opportunity to make small changes that do add up for bigger impact. And a way to do that would be through transparency and visualizing that information that we can provide clients right now in an area that has been quite nebulous and frustrating for those customers who might be using more than one cloud provider. This tool is agnostic, and it helps you look across all cloud providers, and it gives you that cost information and the emissions information. So there is some opportunity there within Scope 3 to have some immediate impact. And then, of course, that can be integrated into other platforms and tools to continue to build on measurements. And I think, we've talked a lot about physical supply chains today. One of the kind of areas that I'm working in, bringing in the kind of from the tech perspective, which is different from my fellow panelists up here, is we really also want to bring into the discourse the digital supply chain. And I think with our growing dependence on IT infrastructure, this pandemic era that we continue to find ourselves in, I wouldn't say we're post-pandemic, we're still in it. We continue to be remote and continue to have kind of this disaggregated approach to all plugging in to businesses. It's not a very efficient way of being, and so our IT footprint and carbon footprint collectively continues to grow. So there's a lot to do there. There's a lot of action to be taken, and we can help do that in a space that's just growing and evolving right now. Those customers that are using tools that cloud providers offer, those tools themselves aren't the most transparent. So again, this is another opportunity to kind of bring another angle into that measurement for those customers and really start that process from physical to digital supply chain.
Yeah, well said.
And Gary, once an organization has measured, has secure measurement, has good tools, and not just using Excel, as we heard in an earlier session by SAP and Boston Consulting Group. Once you have the measurements, how do you get action within the company? I know that's a broad question, but perhaps you can put some specific rigor to it.
I mean, one of the ways that I've been successful in gaining traction is creating, well, first of all, your goals have to roll up to some kind of corporate goals. And then incorporating all of that methodology into how you evaluate all of your deals. Like every company, whether it's formal or informal, has your ROI calculation, your IRR, your net present value. You have a hurdle rate. There's a way that every company evaluates investments, evaluates projects, evaluates relationships, evaluates suppliers with KPIs. Part of what you need to do is you need to find a way, based on your business model and how you deliver to your customers, you deliver product, incorporating these goals for your suppliers into how you evaluate projects. What that's going to do is that's going to begin changing the paradigm of how you award business, how you do business, how you structure deals, and it's going to then put pressure on those suppliers to make that happen. And there has to be, a lot of times mutually beneficial negotiations. We have to remember, especially the good thing or the advantage of working on supply chain emissions is that most of your suppliers, if not all of them, also have emissions goals and targets, and even some of them might not have targets, but they have a message that they want to talk about. So you have to use that as leverage when you negotiate these deals. But it has to start with the evaluation, with the methodology of how you look at these deals, and it has to start really early in the process. And that's really that's a start, but that's how you make headway.
Jared, anything to add? You look.
I was just reading all these
informed.
wonderful questions coming in here, but
Okay.
I think that you hit the nail on the head there with those suppliers also have opportunities or targets of their own, and I think that engaging suppliers and maybe addressing one of these questions here, are suppliers really going to participate in this, and it's helping them understand what they can get out of it as well, right? It's when companies start to see the ROI opportunities in being more sustainable, like emissions reductions, maybe in scope 1.4 and lease your own vehicle fleets. These are great opportunities for them to save money as well and win contracts with customers. And so helping them, I always say it's explaining the why message. Why am I asking you for this? How can you benefit from it? What are you going to get out of it as well as me? Really helps to engage those suppliers, because there will be some level of resistance there.
Mm-hmm. So before we get into the specific questions, and they do look relevant and pertinent to your expertise, and you're on the front lines, all of you in one way or another, talk a little bit about the SEC proposal. I know there was a session this morning, and whether or not you think the proposal, which specifically would make certain emission targets and reporting of success or failure material, meaning an average shareholder or prospective shareholder might buy or would be likely to buy or sell stock on the news. So it would only apply to publicly traded companies, some of them, not all right now. And as one of you said when we were discussing it, those who have been virtuous could be punished the most. They've announced their goals, those who haven't. So I'm sure that will all work out. And we heard in some of the sessions that materiality is difficult to define. I know it is. $1 billion deal for one company might be material, and a $10 billion deal literally might not be for that company. But I think it's like Supreme Court Justice Potter Stewart years ago said, pornography is hard to define, but you know it when you see it. So I think the general counsels know what materiality is. It'll be subjective to a degree, but it's pretty hard. So all that leads into, Jared, maybe you could approach, and Lisa, jump in. Would you say that this will be good for companies, for society, for the achievement of these noble, if you will, environmental, social, and government targets?
Yeah, well, I mean, things oftentimes start with regulation, and then they take on a life of its own. I'm going to use a totally off-topic social accountability standard called conflict minerals. Anybody here familiar with conflict minerals? All right, lots of hands go up. So, conflict minerals, right, started as a little sneak in, like a highway in a bill from some home state, right? In Dodd-Frank 1502, or Dodd-Frank Act, right, the Financial Reform Act, and 1502 covered conflict minerals. I happened to be on a flight one time going from where I lived at the time, Portland, Oregon, to Washington, D.C., and I was going over to Switzerland to audit some gold refineries, and And there was this really twitchy guy sitting right next to me, and it happened to be Congressman Peter DeFazio from Oregon, who was one of the original authors of Dodd-Frank 1502. And so he's asking me what I do for a living, and I told him that I did conflict minerals validation for Intel Corporation, and I was on my way to some gold refineries. So he was just tickled pink to talk to me about this, and he said, what is this about for you, right? And so I'm talking to him about this, and I said, well, what's the motivation for getting started here? Because there's no enforcement action on this regulation, right? And there still today is not, right? The SEC even tried to overturn it at one point. It's like the only remaining dinosaur of Dodd-Frank 1502 is the only remaining dinosaur of Dodd-Frank still in existence today. And he said, it's not really about what it is on paper. It's about creating accountability and non-financial reporting obligations, transparency in supply chains for companies, right? So the SEC's Mandatory Climate Disclosure Act is going to start for some transparency internally to those activities of companies, right? So that's what it's really about, is holding companies accountable to say, I've got to say something about my organization here that I may not want to say. I've got to open my kimono a little bit. And that's how these things start. Think of like the German Supply Chains Act, the French Duty of Vigilance, the EU Non-Financial Reporting Directive. All of these regulations start, but then the market starts to take on a life of its own, right? For example, again, conflict minerals. If you have one of those solutions within your organizations today, I 100% guarantee you're doing more than what the SEC disclosure requirements are, because it's a part of your reputation, right? It's a part of your social accountability efforts. And so as an organization, you're going beyond what that mandatory disclosure opportunity is, because the market has moved there. And so this regulation will start the train down the tracks for organizations to do more, to do better, to be more transparent. And when you're transparent about things that don't necessarily make you look good, right, then maybe you're going to start driving changes as an organization. So a little anecdotally there, but I'll stop there and let my fellow panelists address it.
Yeah, I would just add there too that so beyond the transparency, which is a place to start, again, through the lens of technology, there creates that the internal incentives to actually make changes as well. So although there's the profit motive and shareholders who are looking to have some basis of comparison between companies so they can ensure that their investments are going to be put towards the company that may come with the least risk, putting that aside, kind of from a different perspective, bottom up, internally, this is also about behavior change, culture change, and giving those practitioners and those in the middle layer of businesses, not just top down, but those in the middle layers, the practitioners, the software engineers who are in charge of, say, the IT functions within organizations, which just about any organization has, they are given, through transparency, information, visualization, this cloud carbon footprint tool I mentioned, just as to be concrete about an actual tool. They have the information there. They can look at the costs. They may not care about the cost because they don't own the budget. Maybe their exec owns the budget, but they are getting insights around what small changes can I make, and as I manage the IT infrastructure using public cloud, I actually have the agency now, even though this falls under scope 3, to make small changes like shift a compute workload to a different region that might be using greener energy. I can delete unused storage space. I can make these small changes, something that we call FinOps. It's an evolving discipline around kind of like the win-win of business and technology and finance and reducing emissions by also optimizing costs. All of that, someone in the middle who actually is in charge of making changes may not care so much about that, but they may be incentivized by the sustainability impact of what they do day to day. And in fact, we have heard from several of our very large technology companies who are our clients who have been using the tool. They take those recommendations, practitioners within the company take those recommendations, and they are actually incentivized. There is something there that makes sense to them, that they are making changes, and all of those small things do add up. I know someone earlier said small changes don't really matter, if I heard her correctly. I disagree. I feel like that's where we have to, action is often with those small changes. And so I think just the transparency and the internal piece is, where is the action happening, where is the impact? And at least in the tech sector, if you can look into what those impacts are, you can actually make those changes and measure them and then continue to evolve and innovate.
In one of the sessions earlier, we heard that finance is among the least functions has the poorest connection to sustainability among the functions in a corporation,
Well,
which is
FinOps
important.
should be more broadly
Yeah.
brought into, I think, the way that we think about sustainability.
Great
and how we do
opportunity
business.
as well.
Well, I also think it depends on the kind of company. We've had some banks here where a finance organization also finances a lot of clean energy, decarbonization, a lot of social impact investing. So it really depends on your business model.
Yeah. And I think you've touched on it here, and I see it touched on in the subjects of the agenda and some of the people who've talked today, that inevitably ESG initiatives have to be tied to business outcomes, sustainable business outcomes, and sustainable, you mentioned it, Jared, reputation. Reputation being worth more than 20% of market cap in most large corporations, and the biggest benefit of reputation meaning trust. And of course, the corollary, that is also true. So, with that in mind, I think, do you agree that that connection should always be thought of? It doesn't diminish an organization's commitment to the goals of ESG. It enhances it, I think, to realize that it's tied into sustainable business and sustainable reputation outcomes.
Well, I'm like John, is the next big thing that's going to impact a company's stock price going to be another Enron thing, or is it going to be that company's social accountability in the market, right?
Mm-hmm.
I mean, look at the biggest stock hits in recent years on companies, whether they bounce back or not. That's not relevant to the point. It's that they had their impacts from labor accountability standards, environmental issues, concerns over that from either consumers or look at companies, prior to COVID, some people were staging walkouts of their employers in the Bay Area because they were saying, hey, these companies are not, being diverse and not embracing DEI, right? So that's a big part of the organization's success is that reputation, right?
Just from a capitalist point of view, the future consumer is demanding it. It's demanding it right now. It's demanding it for us. I mean, we have companies, individuals, large groups that won't even step foot in a WeWork without certain disclosures, it's even going further for the first time in my career, where the disclosures and the information don't matter as much anymore. Now it's about impact. So just on a very calculated point of view, the motivation doesn't necessarily have to be doing the right thing or the passionate thing or even regulations. It's the reality is
it's the end
present.
result.
Yes, the consumer demands it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Super points. Would you feel free to have a go at these questions, whichever one appeals to you? I think we've touched on some of them. Gary, you're
suppliers in APAC definitely will. It depends on what the goals are. It depends on who your suppliers are, and it depends on your leverage. But I have had luck with certain suppliers in APAC. Going pretty far downstream, just talking about environmental impact. So I do think it's very possible.
Mm-hmm. What about Ascent?
Yeah, well, looking at that first one there, let's see here. How do you address high risk, high impact, hidden indirect supply chains? That's a good one because. With your thinking about keeping in the context of Scope 3 emissions, right, and the emissions that contributes, because the hidden risks there are, I guess I would say, don't go in there and define what your risks could be before you investigate those supply chains, right? Palm oil has big impacts on not only environmental impacts, but then on social accountability, right? If you've ever been to Sumatra in Indonesia and seen some of those palm oil facilities, they're a little sketchy, right? I've been to a few of those myself and done some audits there. So there's social accountability issues, but then in the context of emissions data here, and you think about indirect, and you go, down into your supply chain. First of all, do you have the capability to map your supply chain? Number one, right? I don't care what anybody tells you out there. There's no great tool that's going to map every single company in your supply chain, because it's either by asking your supply chain who their tiers are, or going through essentially trade data, looking at customs clearance information to identify who suppliers are. But what you might do is talk to your direct suppliers and see what they're doing to go deeper on these programs. Like I work with a couple of companies that do furniture, make soaps with palm oil, and what they're doing is.
That question?
I didn't actually. I would admit if I did that one, but that was kind of interesting.
Didn't expect to talk about palm oil.
Yeah, but exactly, right? But that's a really good question, because companies, what they're doing is they're going and following standards, right? Like Sustainable Forestry Initiative, right? And saying, well, I'm not directly buying from the farms, so to speak, for this wood, but I'm going to go to my direct supplier and I'm going to see if they have FSC certificates from their suppliers to gather information on those farms. Same thing with the palm oil directive and what you can get from those suppliers. And so maybe companies are moving procurement indirectly by making demands with their first tier about who those organizations are buying their raw materials from, right? And then the initiatives that have been set up through, again, standards. I talk about standards like a broken record. If these guys are a part of those organizations, then they're obviously going to have a better opportunity to sell the companies who are looking for that specifically when they're purchasing raw materials or finished goods.
If you don't know where you're going, any road will get you there, right? Yeah. And you might end up in the wrong place.
Yeah.
Choose a question, young man.
How are companies motivating tier 2 and tier 3 suppliers? You got to build it into the contract with KPIs. I mean, it's pretty simple. I come at it from a supplier procurement supply chain angle, and I'm kind of echoing back to what I said earlier. It starts in the beginning, before you're even having a competitive process. You outline the methodology, you have the performance contract language agreed on before anybody even enters that. So now you're having suppliers who are ready and motivated competing against each other, and those are the only ones. And that's the key. That's why starting early in the process is so important. And then it's already built into the performance of their contract, and whether it's fees at risk, whether it's extra years being executed, extra options. There's so many financial and non-financial ways to incentivize, but has to start in the beginning, and you get a lot more traction when you're putting suppliers who are already motivated to do this competing against each other.
Wow, very interesting. Lisa?
These are really supply chain focused, so I'm not seeing one that I think I can add a tech lens to.
Supply chain emissions important? Yes.
Yes, there you go. Well said.
Thank you. Thanks.
Well, we talked about performance. It's all performance, isn't it? Measurement and performance and reporting. Is that right?
It is. And I'll keep touching on the same question about getting deeper into your supply chain with tier 2 and tier 3. I'll kind of say it in a funny anecdote here that I used to do a lot of metals audits and in the metals industry, and I'm meeting this gentleman online about I'm auditing his refinery, and he says, we have 100% clean energy in our refinery. I can't wait to come and have you see this and take a tour of this. And I go, it's in the Yunnan province of China in the middle of absolute nowhere. And he said, look, I've got nothing but clean energy. And he had donkeys bringing the material out of the mines to the refinery. And I said, wow, that's interesting. What about the 63 backhoes you have up on the hill and the emissions out of those guys? And what about the wood-fired furnaces that you have melting this tin down here? And so, like, culturally, he had a different lens of what clean energy was all about, right? And so when we're motivating tier 2 and tier 3 suppliers, oftentimes what we have to do is explain what we're trying to get at and not just forcibly tell them things. So not to contradict the contract idea, that's very, very important. Scorecard points and all of that is really important when talking to suppliers, but also explaining it in a way where they understand what they can get out of it and the cultural differences of how it might not necessarily apply to their thought process there.
How do you cope with the thought of the enormity of the challenges of the different scopes of emissions and knowing what's going on with the various suppliers and your own greenhouse gas emissions. How do you cope with that and with looming larger international and domestic SEC requirements, for example? It seems to me it'd be a daunting task that requires real teamwork inside, real communication, which was always important, but now it'll be more necessary thanks to regulation and government.
You know, John, Lisa went to Berkeley. Did you know that? She's probably got a really amazing thing to say on this.
You mentioned it.
What I wanted to say was a couple things. You just threw me off with
That's
the
okay.
I'm sorry. I'm sorry.
But so there's the framework that so there's scope 3 emissions that I know people are saying I don't know what to do with that. There's the safe harbor or safe harbor component of the SEC rule that's being proposed, and I feel like that's the escape hatch for better or worse. And I feel like I think you were saying a little bit about, well, you know, if it's not material, if I didn't disclose it as one of my targets, then I don't have to worry about it. And I just kind of feel like the gates are wide open now, and everyone's just going at measuring it. And for better or worse too, I think double counting could be a good thing, because I think, you know, I get that question a lot, is how, you know, someone's scope 3 emissions is someone else's scope 1 and 2 emissions, and how do you account for double counting? And I'm like, go for it. Not that I would say that, this is my personal opinion, I'm not saying I would say that directly to a client, but to address your question of how do I cope with it as someone who's been in this field for a really long time, and we're having the same discussions that we were having in undergrad and graduate school around you know, carbon taxes and carbon trading and carbon pricing and talk, right? Which everyone is saying. But I think the double counting is let's do it. Let's just start measuring it. And the double counting could be a good thing, because in fact, then we're accounting for one another's. That's kind of going into that entree of collaboration. Is I may be, you know, measuring something that you've already measured, but good, that gets us all pointed in the right direction. So you know, I think there's probably a lot to be said about how to avoid the double counting when it really comes time for us to really have a comparable framework. But we're not there yet, so I think that's just where we are.
And I think, you know, like, it's not just about that, you know, there's opportunities for double counting there, but there's also, if you don't get into the details of scope 3, then you can't truly do an LCA. You can't do a life cycle assessment of those raw materials within your products. And so you need to get that data directly from a company, and it can't just be, oh, I've got carbon offsets in my program, don't worry about it, you don't need my emissions data, or well, I'm going to gather factors and I'm going to do this. No, the ultimate goal is to get to the CO2 equivalence of every raw material, so that you can put that together and say this is what the total carbon footprint of my product is, and you can't do that without getting into the supply chain.
Sure, and although safe harbor language will give some protection, there will still be class action suits by shareholders or other stakeholders when you don't meet
Just
the
enough
materiality
accountability,
emissions goal. So one other thing we haven't touched on is greenwashing. And I think you all had, we briefly talked, a brief perspective on it, succinct.
I mean, yeah, it's tough to talk about right at the end. I'll comment on greenwashing kind of as an answer to your previous question on how do you cope with, you know, the enormity of this task. Okay. And I almost think like greenwashing in this sense is a part of that. But for me, who again has seen the other side, much like you've peeked behind the curtain, you've seen what actually happens at refineries.
You've seen the donkeys.
And seen the donkeys, right. To me, it's you cope with it the same way you cope with greenwashing. There has to be impact. Like, I think it's time that we stop talking about it. I think measuring it comprehensively across all verticals is a great first step, but to really deal with the enormity of this task and how long it's going to take, personally, I like to go to sleep at night knowing that I've made some kind of impact. You can't let the perfect get in the way of the good. As long as I'm just not talking about it, as long as there is an impact, that I'm not just measuring it, I'm not just pleasing my stockholders, I'm not just making my customers happy, that the impact is there, as little as sometimes as it has to be, I think that's the way that you deal with the enormity of it. And I think greenwashing is, kind of the antithesis of that, where you're dealing with the enormity of it by talking about it. And that's not really dealing with the enormity of it. It's denial.
Super. We were always taught in media relations, and don't ever say, I'll take one more question, because it might be a bad answer. But we'll just take one more question, because it'll be more positive than that last subject, I think, that I put forth. No, not the way you categorize it. Yeah, we have to go. How do you feel on a scale of 1 to 10 about the future of emissions and climate? Do you feel optimistic that all of this is leading somewhere very good or bad?
I think in our lifetimes, the foundation for actually making profound, lots of buzzwords in one sense, actually making
Say
profound
blockchain. Throw blockchain
no
in there.
way.
All right.
No chance. The framework for the human race to at least have a path to real change, I think will exist. I don't know if that will reach that goal in our lifetimes, but I think that there will be a clear path to it.
I'm feeling better. Make me feel
I have a
better.
child, so I sure hope so. That's all I'm going to say about
God
that.
bless you. Lisa.
Yeah, I think that question is always has to be asked within the context of a time frame. 100 years versus 300 years. I would say within the next 50 years, I'm happy to say that we do have I'm happy to see that we have financial regulation now for the first time, specifically addressing these scopes and providing a framework that other businesses can be looking to. There are many out there. I think it's really about the markets and investments that are going to, for better or worse, make the changes. So do I have to give you a number? I don't think they did. So.
No, we're looking pretty good for the time targets set in the Reuters events description, 2030, 2050. Looking okay, huh? Looking somewhat okay.
Yes,
Thanks,
we'll say
everybody.
that.
You've been a great
Thank you.
audience. Thank you.